we'll start with looking at the relevant cash flows. We discussed this very briefly earlier and in topic 2. When we talk about what cash flows we care about, and again, this is going to drive the inputs of your pro formas. So when we talk about what cash flows we care about, any cash flow that comes into or out of being because a project is undertaken is what we call relevant, and therefore it's what we need to focus on. We only want to consider those cash flows that are directly related to the project that we're invested in. So if I'm using my Disney example of building a new theme park, any cash flow that exists or no longer exists because of my new theme park should be accounted for. And so really what we're looking at is a change in cash flows. It's all these are all changes, and incremental cash flows, just changes incremental cash flows. So the incremental cash flow would be the difference between the firm's cash flows in the future with a project versus without the project. And the best way to think about this is through an example. Suppose Coca-Cola is going to currently projects their sales to be revenues to be $45 billion in 2021. They have a new diet soda that they might release, and if they release it, Coca-Cola would then project their revenues to be $47 billion in 2021. Some of those could be direct sales from the new diet soda. Maybe there's some other cash flows coming, some other revenues coming as well. Doesn't matter. With new soda, 47 billion, without 45. So the incremental cash flow from this new diet soda would be exactly $2 billion. And this would be what we care about. We care about these new revenues of $2 billion. And our focus here is going to be on the cash flows. So even though we're dealing with income statements and balance sheets, the key focus for us will ultimately be the cash flows. We get the cash flows from those financial statements, those pro formas, but the focus is always on cash flows. To make this a little bit easier, we're going to use what we call the standalone principle. The standalone principle is where we evaluate a project based on the incremental cash flows only. But what we do is we view the project almost as its own little firm. And what I mean by that is it has its own pro forma financial statements, its own revenues, its own costs, its own assets, and ultimately its own cash flows. And so what we can do is build our pro forma financial statements essentially off of projections from a new project. And what we'll do is compare the value of the mini firm, right, to its cost. And if you sort of think about finance, we've talked about this before, the value of anything is simply, in a discounted cash flow model, the value will be the present value of all its future cash flows, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So this tells you sort of what is the relevant cash flows. In the next section, I want to talk about what are the different types of these incremental cash flows, and that'll ultimately lead us into the project cash flows and some important caveats with net working capital and depreciation.